There's a specific sound a car engine makes when it's pulling away from a curb for the last time, a particular pitch of tires against gravel that some part of my body still recognizes, decades later, whenever I hear something similar on an ordinary street. My name is Corinthia Boyd, and I was 7 years old the morning my mother parked outside Havenwood Children's Home, walked me to the front steps, knocked twice on a heavy wooden door, and drove away before anyone had even answered. I remember the weight of my small suitcase, packed the night before with clothes that no longer quite fit, a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, and a photograph of the two of us that I would keep, carefully protected, for the following 2 decades. I remember my mother, Delphine, kneeling briefly beside me on those steps, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened my collar, her eyes refusing to fully meet mine. "I need you to be brave for me, Corinthia," she said, her voice carrying a strange, controlled calm that I understood, even at 7, as something people used when they were trying very hard not to fall apart completely. "This is just for a little while. I promise." She didn't wait for the door to open. She didn't say goodbye, not properly, not the way I'd imagined goodbyes were supposed to happen. She simply stood, walked back toward her car, and drove away, leaving me standing on those steps with a suitcase, a one-eared rabbit, and a growing, devastating understanding that a little while meant something entirely different than what she'd implied. A tall, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Adeline Okafor eventually opened that door, finding me still standing exactly where my mother had left me, staring at an empty street where a car had disappeared several minutes earlier. "Come inside, sweetheart," she said gently, extending her hand toward mine. "Let's get you settled." I didn't cry that first day. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think it matters to everything that followed. Something in me, some instinct I didn't fully understand until much later, decided in that exact moment that crying wouldn't bring my mother back, wouldn't undo whatever decision had led her to that doorstep, wouldn't change anything about the reality I now needed to navigate. I walked through that heavy wooden door into Havenwood Children's Home, 23 years before international headlines would eventually carry my name, 23 years before the woman who'd driven away without saying goodbye would finally call me again. I had no idea, standing in that unfamiliar hallway at 7 years old, exactly how far that doorstep would eventually carry me. Havenwood Children's Home housed nearly 40 children when I arrived, ranging in age from infants to teenagers preparing to age out of the system entirely, all of us navigating our own complicated versions of abandonment, loss, and uncertain futures. Mrs. Okafor, who ran the facility alongside her husband, a quiet, patient man named Reginald, became something close to the stable presence I desperately needed during those first difficult months. She noticed, within my first few weeks, that I processed my grief through relentless, focused activity rather than open emotional expression, spending hours reading whatever books the home's modest library contained, filling notebooks with careful, methodical handwriting long before other children my age had developed similar skills. "You've got something special in you, Corinthia," she told me during one quiet evening, watching me work through a library book considerably beyond my grade level. "I don't know exactly what shape it's going to take yet, but I can see it building in there." I shared a room during those years with a girl named Winifred Castellan, 2 years older than me, who'd arrived at Havenwood after her own parents' deaths in a house fire, and who became, over the following years, something close to the sister I never had. "Do you think our families think about us?" I asked her once, maybe 8 years old, lying awake in the darkness of our shared room. "I don't know," Winifred said honestly, her voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who'd already learned not to expect comforting answers to difficult questions. "I think it's easier for some people to stop thinking about things that hurt too much to keep thinking about." I turned that observation over in my mind for years afterward, trying to understand exactly what category my own mother's absence fell into, whether she'd simply stopped thinking about me entirely, or whether some part of her continued carrying the weight of that decision the same way I carried the weight of that morning on the doorstep. I excelled academically throughout my years at Havenwood, a fact that drew attention from a rotating cast of caseworkers and teachers who occasionally suggested I possessed unusual potential worth cultivating carefully. A caseworker named Priscilla Hendricks, assigned to my file during my 10th year at the home, became particularly invested in ensuring I received opportunities that might otherwise have been unavailable to a child in the foster and orphanage system. I've seen a lot of kids come through this system, Priscilla told me during one of our regular meetings, and I don't say this lightly. You've got the kind of drive that could take you absolutely anywhere, Corinthia, if we can just get you the right doors to walk through. I had no idea, hearing that observation at 10 years old, exactly how many doors I would eventually need to walk through, or how far beyond that original doorstep I would ultimately travel. Are you enjoying the story? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're enjoying it so far, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because believe me, this story is only getting started. Now, let's get back into it. Priscilla Hendricks became instrumental during my early teenage years, connecting me with a scholarship program specifically designed for academically gifted children within the foster care system. An opportunity that eventually placed me at a competitive boarding school 3 hours from Havenwood when I turned 14. Leaving Havenwood, even for genuinely positive reasons, carried its own complicated grief, Winifred and Mrs. Okafor both feeling like additional losses layered atop the original loss that had brought me there in the first place. "You're not losing us," Mrs. Okafor told me during our tearful goodbye, holding my face gently between her hands. "You're just building something bigger than what we could offer you here. That's exactly what we've been hoping for, sweetheart, even though it means missing you every single day." The boarding school presented its own significant challenges, my scholarship status making me acutely aware of class differences separating me from wealthier classmates, several of whom made their own uncomfortable assumptions about foster children explicit through casual, careless cruelty. A physics teacher named Dr. Augustine Farrow noticed my struggle to navigate these social dynamics while simultaneously excelling academically, becoming an unexpected mentor who saw past my defensive reticence to the genuine intellectual hunger underneath. "Ignore the ones who can't see past where you started," he told me during one particularly difficult semester. "The only thing that will actually matter, in the long run, is where you end up, and you're building something extraordinary, Corinthia, regardless of how uncomfortable certain classmates feel about your path to get here." I threw myself into astrophysics during those years, drawn toward the subject partly through Dr. Farrow's mentorship and partly through a genuine, growing fascination with questions considerably larger than my own personal history, the vast, indifferent scale of the universe offering strange, unexpected comfort compared to the more intimate wounds I carried from that Havenwood doorstep. I graduated at the top of my class, securing admission to a prestigious university with a full scholarship that finally, completely, alleviated any remaining financial barriers standing between me and my growing academic ambitions. Winifred, who'd aged out of the foster system by this point, attended my graduation ceremony, sitting proudly in the audience alongside Mrs. Okafor and Priscilla, 3 women who'd each contributed significantly to carrying me from that abandoned doorstep to this considerably brighter horizon. My mother did not attend. I hadn't expected her to, hadn't heard from her in the 11 years since that morning outside Havenwood's front door, though I noticed, watching Mrs. Okafor's proud expression during my graduation speech, that the family I'd actually built across those difficult years felt, by that point, considerably more substantial than the biological connection I'd lost so abruptly at 7 years old. I had no idea, walking across that graduation stage, exactly how much further my academic journey would eventually carry me, or how significantly it would eventually intersect, unexpectedly, with international recognition. University unfolded as both genuine intellectual awakening and continued, complicated processing of everything that had happened at 7 years old, my studies in astrophysics providing structure and purpose while therapy, which I finally began seriously pursuing during my sophomore year, provided space to process grief I'd spent over a decade suppressing through relentless academic achievement. My therapist, a thoughtful woman named Dr. Marisol Quintero, helped me understand, gradually, that my mother's abandonment had shaped considerably more of my personality and choices than I'd previously acknowledged. My drive toward achievement functioning, at least partially, as an attempt to prove worthiness that a 7-year-old version of myself had apparently concluded I lacked. "You don't have to keep proving you deserve to be kept," Dr. Quintero told me during one particularly significant session. "Your mother's decision reflected her own limitations and circumstances, Corinthia, not some objective assessment of your actual worth as a person." I sat with that observation for considerable time, understanding intellectually what she meant while still, emotionally, carrying decades of accumulated evidence suggesting otherwise. I met my closest university friend, a brilliant, warm astrophysics classmate named Yara Delacroix, during my junior year, our friendship deepening through countless late nights working through complex equations together. Yara becoming someone I trusted enough to eventually share my full history with, including that specific, devastating morning outside Havenwood's front door. "I can't imagine carrying that," Yara told me, genuine empathy evident in her expression. "But Corinthia, look at everything you've built despite it. I don't think that mourning defines you nearly as much as you might still believe it does." I completed my doctorate in astrophysics at 26, my dissertation research focusing on gravitational wave detection methods, work that eventually connected me with a prestigious international research team studying black hole mergers through increasingly sophisticated observational technology. I joined that research team the following year, relocating to work alongside some of the field's most respected scientists. My specific contributions to detection algorithm improvements beginning to attract genuine attention within the broader astrophysics community. Winifred and Mrs. Okafor remained constant presences throughout these years, celebrating each milestone with a pride that felt, increasingly, like the genuine familial support I'd lost that morning at 7 years old. Though the specific wound of my mother's absence never fully disappeared, simply integrated itself, gradually, into a life that had grown considerably larger and more meaningful than that single devastating morning had ever suggested might be possible. I had no idea, joining that research team at 27, exactly how significantly my work would eventually contribute to a discovery that would carry my name across international headlines. The discovery that eventually made international headlines occurred during my 31st year. Nearly a decade of research work culminating in a breakthrough detection method that allowed our team to identify and confirm a previously theoretical category of gravitational wave signature. Work that fundamentally advanced humanity's understanding of black hole formation in the universe's earliest periods. I served as lead author on the paper announcing this discovery, my name appearing prominently across scientific journals and, subsequently, mainstream international news coverage as the breakthrough's significance became apparent to broader audiences beyond the specialized astrophysics community. The attention arrived swiftly and, in some ways, overwhelmingly, interview requests flooding in from major news outlets, my face suddenly appearing on television segments discussing the discovery's implications. My name circulating through headlines I could hardly process as actually referring to myself, given how far that recognition felt from the 7-year-old girl once abandoned on an orphanage doorstep. Winifred called immediately upon seeing the first headlines, her voice carrying genuine, overwhelming pride. "Corinthia, do you understand what you've actually done? Do you understand how far you've come from that doorstep?" Mrs. Okafor, now retired from running Havenwood but still living nearby the facility she'd once managed, sent a message that made me cry for the first time in years, genuine, overwhelming emotion finally breaking through decades of careful, controlled composure. "I always told you there was something special building in there," she wrote. "I just didn't know it would end up changing how humanity understands the entire universe." Dr. Farrow, my old physics teacher, reached out as well, genuine pride evident throughout his message, reminding me of exactly how far I'd traveled since those difficult early boarding school years when classmates had made careless assumptions about my worth based on my foster care background. Amid this overwhelming wave of recognition and celebration, another call arrived, one I hadn't anticipated, hadn't prepared myself for, despite over 2 decades of occasionally wondering whether this exact moment might eventually happen. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and something instinctive, some deep, buried recognition I couldn't fully explain, made me answer despite the unfamiliarity. "Corinthia," the voice said, and I felt something entire collapse and rebuild simultaneously in my chest, recognizing, even after 24 years, the specific timbre of my mother's voice. "It's your mother. I saw you on the news. I can't believe it's really you." I stood frozen, phone pressed against my ear, 24 years of accumulated grief, achievement, and unresolved questions colliding all at once in a single, devastating moment. I had no idea, standing there absorbing the sound of my mother's voice after over 2 decades of silence, exactly what I actually wanted to say to her. I didn't respond immediately, the silence stretching long enough that my mother eventually spoke again, her voice carrying uncertainty I'd never once heard from her during my childhood memories. "Corinthia, are you there? I know this must be a shock, hearing from me after everything." "It's been 24 years, I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected given the emotional chaos churning beneath my composure. "You drove away without saying goodbye. You didn't call, didn't write, didn't check on me even once during 24 years, and now you're calling because you saw me on the news." "I know how that looks," she said quickly, defensiveness threading through her voice despite obvious attempts to sound conciliatory. "But Corinthia, I need you to understand. Leaving you at Havenwood wasn't some careless decision. I was struggling, genuinely struggling, financially and emotionally, after your father left. I thought, at the time, that you'd actually have a better chance at a stable life there than staying with me while I was falling apart. You could have visited," I said, feeling old grief resurface with unexpected intensity. "You could have called. You could have written a single letter across 24 years explaining any of this instead of simply disappearing entirely from my life." My mother was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried something that sounded almost like genuine shame. "I was ashamed, Corinthia. Every year that passed without reaching out made it feel more impossible to finally break that silence. I told myself you were better off without the complicated guilt of periodic contact from someone who'd already failed you so completely. I convinced myself staying away entirely was actually the kinder choice." "That wasn't your decision to make on my behalf," I said, feeling something clarify within my chest despite the continued emotional weight of this unexpected conversation. "You don't get to decide, unilaterally, what I needed or didn't need from you across 2 decades of childhood and early adulthood. That decision should have included me, should have at least offered me the choice of maintaining some connection, however complicated, rather than simply erasing yourself entirely from my life." "You're right," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I know that now, watching everything you've built despite my absence. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness I haven't earned, Corinthia. I just needed you to know how proud I am, even though I have absolutely no right to claim any part in what you've become." I sat with that admission, old grief and genuine, complicated confusion tangling together as I tried to determine exactly what, if anything, I wanted from this unexpected reconnection. I had no idea, ending that difficult first conversation, exactly how I wanted to proceed regarding my mother's sudden, headline-prompted reappearance in my life. I spent the following weeks processing that conversation extensively with Dr. Quintero, my therapist, working through decades of complicated grief that my mother's sudden reappearance had unexpectedly reactivated despite years of careful, gradual healing. "You're allowed to feel multiple contradictory things simultaneously," Dr. Quintero told me during one particularly difficult session. Anger at her disappearance. Curiosity about her explanation. Grief for the relationship you never got to have. None of those feelings need to cancel each other out or resolve neatly before you decide how to move forward. I also discussed the situation extensively with Winifred and Mrs. Okafor, both of whom offered perspective shaped by their own complicated histories with family loss and reconnection. "You don't owe her anything," Winifred said firmly during one conversation. "Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even continued communication if you decide that's not something you want. She made her choice 24 years ago, Corinthia. You get to make your own choice now about what, if anything, you want moving forward." Mrs. Okafor, characteristically, offered a more measured perspective. I think you should follow whatever your own heart actually needs here, sweetheart, not what you think you're supposed to feel given how this story might look from the outside. Some people need to close doors completely to heal properly. Others need at least partial reconnection to find genuine peace. Only you know which path actually serves your own well-being. I decided, eventually, to meet my mother in person, curiosity and unresolved questions ultimately outweighing my initial instinct to simply reject any further contact entirely. We met at a quiet restaurant 3 weeks after that initial phone call, my mother arriving first, looking considerably older and more worn than the memory I'd carried from that Havenwood doorstep. Decades of apparent hardship visible in ways that complicated my previously simpler anger toward her. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, her voice carrying genuine nervousness as I settled into the seat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I have a lot of questions," I said honestly. "I'm not agreeing to some immediate, uncomplicated reconciliation just by being here. I need to understand what actually happened, why you made the choices you made, before I can decide what, if anything, this relationship might look like moving forward." My mother nodded, visible acceptance of these terms evident in her expression. "I understand completely. I'll answer whatever you want to know as honestly as I can manage." I had no idea, sitting across from her in that quiet restaurant, exactly what her full explanation would ultimately reveal, or how significantly it would complicate my previously straightforward understanding of that devastating morning at 7 years old. My mother's explanation unfolded slowly over the following 2 hours, details emerging that added considerable complexity to my previously simpler understanding of her original decision. "Your father left 6 months before I brought you to Havenwood," she explained, "and I fell into a depression I genuinely didn't know how to climb out of. I lost my job. We lost our apartment. I was staying with a cousin who made it clear, eventually, that the arrangement couldn't continue much longer with a child involved." "You could have told me any of this," I said, though with less anger than I'd expected given how carefully I'd prepared for this conversation. "Even simplified for a 7-year-old, you could have explained something instead of just disappearing." "I know," she admitted. "I've spent 24 years understanding exactly how badly I failed you in that specific moment, in the silence, in the disappearing rather than at least attempting some kind of honest explanation. I told myself, at the time, that a clean break would actually be easier for you, less painful than watching me struggle to explain something I could barely understand myself." She explained, further, that she'd eventually stabilized financially several years later, remarried briefly to a man who, she admitted with visible shame, had actively discouraged any attempt to reconnect with me, framing it as reopening old wounds unnecessarily rather than genuine healing. "That's not an excuse," she clarified quickly, watching my expression carefully. "I should have found the courage to reconnect regardless of his opinion. I'm not trying to shift blame for my own choices onto someone else's influence." "Did you ever check on me?" I asked. "Through the years, did you ever try to find out how I was actually doing, even without direct contact?" My mother's eyes filled with tears at this question. "I called Havenwood twice, actually, when you were around 12 and again around 16, using a different name so they wouldn't necessarily connect me to your file directly. I just needed to know you were safe, that you were doing well." Mrs. Okafor, I believe, spoke with me both times, though I never identified myself directly. I sat with that revelation, understanding, with complicated new clarity, that my mother's absence hadn't been entirely as complete or indifferent as I'd assumed throughout the preceding decades, though the fundamental wound of her physical and emotional absence remained genuinely significant regardless of these periodic, anonymous check-ins. "I appreciate you telling me all of this," I said finally, "but I need you to understand something important. This explanation helps me understand your choices better. It doesn't automatically restore trust that took decades to fully break down." "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm not expecting immediate trust, Corinthia. I'm just grateful for the opportunity to finally explain, after all these years of silence I should never have allowed to stretch quite so long." I had no idea, leaving that restaurant after our extended conversation, exactly how I wanted our relationship to develop moving forward, or whether genuine reconciliation remained possible after such prolonged, complicated absence. I confirmed my mother's account with Mrs. Okafor during a subsequent visit to Havenwood, curious whether her memory matched the specific details my mother had shared during our restaurant conversation. "She's telling the truth," Mrs. Okafor confirmed, settling into her familiar armchair in the small apartment she'd moved into after retiring from running the children's home. 2 calls, exactly as she described, both times using a different name, both times asking careful, indirect questions about how you were progressing rather than requesting direct contact. I always suspected it was her, though I never had confirmation until just now. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, genuine curiosity rather than accusation shaping the question. "Because I wasn't certain enough to potentially create false hope or unnecessary pain, depending on how those calls might have actually reflected her genuine intentions," Mrs. Okafor said thoughtfully. "I've learned, over decades running that home, that sometimes information needs to wait until the person it concerns is genuinely ready to receive it properly." I decided, over the following months, to maintain cautious, gradual contact with my mother, our relationship developing slowly, carefully, built on considerably more honest foundation than the silence and abandonment that had originally defined our history. We had dinner monthly, conversations that remained occasionally difficult but increasingly genuine, both of us navigating decades of accumulated distance with patience I hadn't initially expected either of us to possess. "I don't think we'll ever have the relationship we might have had if none of this happened," I told her honestly during one particularly significant conversation. Too much time passed, too much genuine hurt accumulated during that silence. "But I think we can build something real now, something different than what we lost, if we're both willing to keep doing this careful, ongoing work." "That's more than I ever expected to receive," she said, tears visible in her eyes. "More than I probably deserve, honestly, given everything you navigated because of my choices." "Maybe," I said, though not unkindly. "But I've spent considerable time in therapy learning that relationships don't have to be about what someone deserves. They can simply be about what actually serves genuine healing and connection moving forward for both people involved." My continued scientific work progressed alongside this careful personal reconciliation, additional research building upon our original gravitational wave discovery. My international recognition continuing to grow through subsequent publications and speaking engagements that occasionally referenced, briefly, my unusual personal history as motivation underlying my scientific dedication. I had no idea, navigating this gradual reconciliation with my mother, exactly how completely my story, from that Havenwood doorstep through international scientific recognition, would eventually resonate with audiences far beyond the astrophysics community itself. It's been 3 years now since that unexpected phone call following international headlines announcing our team's gravitational wave discovery. 3 years since my mother's voice first broke through 24 years of accumulated silence. My relationship with her remains genuinely complicated but authentically rebuilding, monthly dinners having evolved into more regular contact, careful trust accumulating gradually across sustained, demonstrated effort on both our parts rather than any single dramatic reconciliation moment. My scientific career continues flourishing, additional discoveries building upon that original breakthrough, my work increasingly focused on mentoring young scientists from foster care and difficult family backgrounds similar to my own, understanding intimately exactly how significant proper support and opportunity can prove for children navigating circumstances comparable to what I once experienced at Havenwood. I established a scholarship fund 2 years ago, named in honor of Mrs. Okafor and Priscilla Hendricks, specifically supporting foster children pursuing STEM education. A gesture that felt like appropriate acknowledgement of exactly how significantly their early belief in my potential shaped everything I eventually became. Winifred remains my closest friend, our bond, forged through shared childhood difficulty at Havenwood, proving considerably more durable than most relationships built on more conventional foundations. She serves on the Scholarship Fund's board now, her own successful career in social work informing exactly which candidates might benefit most significantly from the specific kind of support we're able to offer. I think often about that original morning outside Havenwood's front door, about the specific sound of my mother's car pulling away, about the 7-year-old girl who decided, in that exact moment, not to cry, choosing instead a quiet, determined resilience that would eventually carry her considerably further than either she or her departing mother could have possibly imagined. I understand now, with the clarity that only decades of processing genuine trauma alongside genuine achievement can provide, that my mother's abandonment, however devastating, however genuinely wrong in its execution, ultimately became just one significant thread within a considerably larger, more complicated story about resilience, chosen family, and the specific human capacity to build extraordinary things from genuinely painful beginnings. People ask me sometimes what I'd say to that 7-year-old girl, standing frozen on that doorstep, watching her mother's car disappear down an unfamiliar street. I tell them I'd say exactly what eventually proved true, that a single devastating morning, however painful, however seemingly final, never actually holds the authority to determine everything a person is capable of eventually becoming. Given enough resilience, enough support from people willing to genuinely show up, and enough stubborn determination to build something extraordinary from wherever life happens to leave you standing. My mother dropped me at an orphanage doorstep at 7 years old and drove away without saying goodbye. 24 years later, she was the first person to call when the entire world finally learned my name, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, we found our way towards something real in the aftermath of that unexpected reconnection. The end.